And thanks to at home for joining us this hour. In 1845, Frederick Douglass, the great American abolitionist, published the first of what would become three autobiographical accounts of his life. The first one was called Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. Frederick Douglass is, of course, one of the greatest Americans of all time. His autobiography is about life as a slave and his struggle to become free. In addition to everything else he did in his life, those written works are some of the most influential written American accounts of anything on any subject. In Narrative of the Life, which is the most widely read of the his three autobiographical accounts, but also in the subsequent autobiographies he wrote as well, including the next one, My Bondage and My Freedom. One of the most harrowing things Frederick Douglass describes about his own life is a year-long period when the man who owned him as a slave decided that young Frederick Douglass was incorrigible. Douglass's owner decided that Frederick Douglass needed, in effect, to be tamed, to be broken. And so he shipped Frederick Douglass off to a man who is literally known as a slave breaker. The slave breaker was named Edward Covey, C-O-V-E-Y. This is part of how Frederick Douglass describes him in My Bondage and My Freedom. He says, quote, I had now lived with him, meaning his slave owner, nearly 9 months, and he had given me a number of severe whippings without any visible improvement in my character or my conduct. Now he was resolved to put me out, as he said, quote, to be broken. There was, in the Bayside, a man named Edward Covey who enjoyed the execrated reputation of being a first-rate hand at breaking young Negroes. Breaking. Frederick Douglass then goes on in chapter after chapter after chapter in this autobiography. Look at this, the experiences at Covey's, unusual brutality of Covey, driven back to Covey's, Covey's manner of proceeding to whip, right? Goes in chapter after chapter after chapter, he describes this experience, the way that Edward Covey tortured him and beat him nearly to death and worked him nearly to death, all to try to destroy Frederick Douglass's spirit, to try to destroy his mind, to turn him into a docile slave who would work without question, whereupon he would then be returned to his owner. And because Frederick Douglass is so capable and so brilliant, his own recounting in his autobiographies of what happened to him in that period of his life, what happened to him when his slave owner sent him to Edward Covey, what happened to him at Edward Covey's hands, what happened to him while he stayed for a year at Edward Covey's farm, and Covey was tasked there with breaking him. Because Frederick Douglass is such a luminous, important, brilliant, inspiring, incredible figure, unparalleled figure in American history, because of what we know he is capable of, because we know what his mind was capable of and what he did for his country in his life. When he recounts what happened to him at the hands of Edward Covey, it is the most dispiriting and desolate and just miserable thing that Douglass writes about. He said, I shall never be able to narrate the mental experience through which it was my lot to pass during my stay at Edward Covey's. I was completely wrecked, changed and bewildered, goaded almost to madness at one time, and at another reconciling myself to my wretched condition. I suffered bodily as well as mentally, he says. The overwork and the brutal chastisements of which I was the victim, combined with that ever-gnawing and soul-devouring thought, I am a slave for life, a slave with no rational ground to hope for freedom. It rendered me a living embodiment of mental and physical wretchedness. That was Frederick Douglass's account of his own life in that lowest period in his own life. And that written account did more than any other to galvanize the American abolitionist movement to bring an end to slavery. And of course, it was not fiction. It really happened, and it really happened just as Frederick Douglass said it did. And Edward Covey was a real person who really did operate a slave-breaking operation at his farm, to which Frederick Douglass was sent. And if you go back to that initial description, Douglas describes Covey's farm as being on the bay side. What he meant by that was that the farm was on the far side of Chesapeake Bay, the far side of Chesapeake Bay from the mainland of Maryland, which is where Douglas was being sent there from. Edward Covey's farm, his slave-breaking operation where he tortured Frederick Douglass and countless others, was this house and its surrounding farmland on the eastern shore of Maryland in a town that's now called St. Michael's. The farm and the house at the farm itself had a name, a fitting name. It was called Mount Misery. About 15 years ago now, a literature professor wrote a very thoughtful piece in the Baltimore Sun newspaper suggesting a new future for Mount Misery, suggesting that the United States of America should consider buying Mount Misery to make it a commemorative site. He argued, would not the most fitting outcome for Mount Misery be as a monument or museum, wherein a key moment from the country's past can find its rightful place in the public memory? The old Edward Covey house deserves our understanding and preservation. The fight between slave and slave breaker that took place there is emblematic of two of the elemental themes of American history: the horrors of legally sanctioned racial violence, and also the nobility of the struggle against it. And then here's actually the kicker from that piece. The professor says, quote, preserving Mount Misery as a public site of contemplation where the meanings of democracy and despotism are given a human face also would help keep St. Michael's from being merely a resort for the wealthy. A resort for the wealthy? Now check this out. The occasion for that call, that well-argued piece in the Baltimore Sun that Mount Misery should be purchased and preserved by this country as a monument to the epic violence committed there against slaves in great numbers, but specifically against one of the greatest Americans of all time. The key role that the torture in that house played in turning on our American conscience to eventually overthrow slavery. The occasion for that call to preserve Mount Misery as a monument to the hell that happened there. The reason the Baltimore Sun published that just less than 15 years ago now was this revelation that was published in the New York Times exactly 15 years ago today. On June 30th, 2006, it's titled Weekends with the President's Men. It's kind of a kicky sidebar piece in the New York Times that was published in the summer of 2006. And that piece revealed that that site on the eastern shore of Maryland, Mount Misery, that house, that farm, had actually been recently purchased and was now being lived in as a private home. Can you imagine, right? I mean, first of all, the house is still called Mount Misery today. That's still the name by which it is known. Who would want to live in a place called Mount Misery? But then you get to the reason that it's called Mount Misery, right? It was the home, it was the actual home. It's the same building that's been standing there since 1804. Frederick Douglass was tortured there in 1833 and 1834. It's the same actual physical place in which the great Frederick Douglass was tortured and beaten and worked nearly to death every day for a year. Whether or not you think that place should be purchased by this country and made into a memorial for the worst, most violent evils of slavery and their role in turning on Americans' conscience to end slavery, right? And that's a substantive and interesting proposal. Whether or not you're into that idea, would you want to live there yourself? Would you like to wake up there in the morning, plan breakfast, have that be your home? Who would do that? That article, published in the New York Times 15 years ago today, was actually controversial at the time that it was published because in writing that piece, it did reveal the exact home address of a senior government official who, in fact, had made Mount Misery his private home. His name was Donald Rumsfeld. And he was, at the time, summer of 2006, struggling to the end of his disastrous tenure as Secretary of Defense under the George W. Bush administration. He lived at the time at Mount Misery. He bought the place in 2003 as he was leading the nation into the invasion of Iraq. That was where he went to get away from Washington while running two disastrous wars. He liked to have the Chinook helicopter drop him off at the slave breakers' home where Frederick Douglass was nearly tortured to death. He could really relax there. Donald Rumsfeld died today at the age of 88. He had a singular career. He made gazillions of dollars in business, running companies that invented NutraSweet and early HD TVs. He served 4 terms in Congress, which is something that's not frequently remembered about him, especially given his later overt and pronounced disdain for Congress. He served in a variety of roles in the Nixon administration before becoming President Gerald Ford's White House Chief of Staff and then Ford's Defense Secretary. George W. Bush brought him back to the Pentagon in 2001 to be Secretary of Defense again.
Is dropped
the only person to have
wide
served 2
open.
non-consecutive terms as Secretary of Defense.
I knew this guy when he was in
11th,
office.
2001, he was in
Did
his office
not
at
know
the
this
Pentagon as
history.
one of the hijacked planes slammed into the building.
My
To his
jaw
credit,
is
Rumsfeld
dropped
helped
to
personally
the
in the immediate
floor.
aftermath of the impact and the fire. He helped rescue people. He stayed on site at the Pentagon that day, all day, while Cheney got rushed to the bunker, and for some reason they just flew the president around in the air for a long time. As if
I'm
they weren't quite sure where
suffering
to put him.
from
Rumsfeld
vicarious
stayed at the Pentagon.
trauma just hearing
In the
this.
aftermath of 9/11, it was Donald Rumsfeld who planned for the invasion of Afghanistan, but then not for what to do in Afghanistan after the invasion. Less than 2 years later, it was Donald Rumsfeld who planned for the American invasion of Iraq, but then not for what to do in Iraq after the initial invasion. As chaos and civil war overwhelmed Iraq in the wake of the U.S. invasion there, Donald Rumsfeld famously insisted that Americans should see all of that as good news, really, because freedom is untidy.
Freedom's untidy, and free people are free to make mistakes and commit crimes and do bad things. Stuff happens.
Stuff happens. Stuff happens. Donald Rumsfeld, who died today, again at the age of 88, was responsible for the planning of the American invasions and the subsequent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. We are only just now getting out of Afghanistan today. When it came to the systematic torture of prisoners in U.S. custody at facilities like Abu Ghraib in Iraq, Rumsfeld, in his memoirs, blamed that on what he called a small group of prison guards who ran amok. The historical record, however, shows that Rumsfeld was sent memos in real time about the actual planning, the actual orders for torture like that to occur as a matter of U.S. policy and on purpose, directed down the chain of command. On the margins of one memo that spelled out that prisoners in U.S. custody should be tortured by, among other things, forcing them to stand for hours at a time, Rumsfeld hand-wrote in the margin, "I stand for 8 to 10 hours a day." Why is standing limited to 4 hours? By which he meant, why aren't they forcing these prisoners to stand for even longer? This doesn't seem harsh enough. There was also the memorable moment in Rumsfeld's tenure as defense secretary, and it was discovered that on more than 1,000 condolences letters that were sent to the families of U.S. servicemen and servicewomen killed in Iraq, Donald Rumsfeld did not feel it was necessary to sign his name. He instead used what's called an auto pen, basically a machine that rubber stamped his name to sign all the supposedly heartfelt condolence letters to the families of American service members killed in action in Iraq. As roadside bombs started killing American service members by the dozen, and then by the hundreds, and then ultimately by the thousands, Secretary Rumsfeld was asked why U.S. forces didn't have up-to-date body armor, why there wasn't more of a rush to get it to them. He replied famously that you go to war with the army you have, not the one you might want or wish to have, implying not only that we didn't have the army that we want, also implying that the timing of that war somehow wasn't our choice, wasn't somehow his choice, and the choice of the other senior officials in the administration who made that decision to invade Iraq based on a false premise, made up supposedly threatening things about Iraq that were not true, that they insisted the American people were true, right? Telling the American people that Iraq had terrible weapons that Iraq didn't actually have. Telling the American people that Iraq was in cahoots with Al-Qaeda when Iraq was not in cahoots with Al-Qaeda. Telling the American people that Iraq was poised to invade us or attack us or come after the U.S. in some devastating way that was imminent? None of that was true, but no one was as enthusiastic a promoter of the false pretext for that war. No one.
No terrorist state poses a greater or more immediate threat to the security of our people and the stability of the world than the regime of Saddam Hussein in Iraq. We have what we consider to be credible evidence that al-Qaeda leaders have sought contacts in Iraq who could help them acquire weapons of mass destruction capabilities.
Do you have hard evidence that they're in Iraq?
Oh, there's no question but that al-Qaeda have moved through and some have stayed.
And that's not just an assumption, we know that.
I know that. If someone is waiting for a so-called smoking gun, it's certain that we will have waited too long.
What do you make of the statement made by the Iraqi government, yesterday that Iraq has no weapons of mass destruction and is not developing any?
They're lying. Next. It is not knowable if force will be used, but if it is to be used, it could last, 6 days, 6 weeks. I doubt 6 months.
I doubt 6 months. Who's telling you that a war in Iraq might last 6 months? Who's saying it'll go that long? I'm Donald Rumsfeld. You can take it from me. Try 6 days. Donald Rumsfeld was also a master at unusually specific lies about the most consequential things that led to that war that ultimately cost hundreds of thousands of lives. He told ABC News, for example, after the invasion, when he was asked, how come the weapons of mass destruction that you guaranteed were there, how come they haven't been found? He insisted to ABC News that not only were there weapons of mass destruction in Iraq that were going to be found, but he knew where they were. He said, quote, "We know where they are. They're in the area around Tikrit and Baghdad, and east, west, south, and north somewhat." Donald Rumsfeld has died today at the age of 88. He did not die at his home at Mount Misery, which was the slave-breaking site of the life-changing and world-changing torture of Frederick Douglass, a place that he bought as a weekend retreat while serving as defense secretary. He died instead in New Mexico at a ranch he had there in Taos. And Donald Rumsfeld's death comes on a day with about 5 weeks worth of news in it otherwise. We're covering a lot of different breaking news stories tonight. Tonight, the Washington Post was first to report. NBC News has now confirmed that a grand jury in Manhattan has filed criminal indictments today against the company of former President Donald Trump and its longtime chief financial officer, Alan Weisselberg.
I can't believe it.
And NBC are both citing two people
I do
familiar
believe
with
it.
the indictments. Again, this means the indictments have